We did not get.
No.
There you are.
It worked. Okay, yay. Thank you. Thanks for your patience. Okay. Hi everyone. I am so happy to be gathered here with you. This is an event honoring Women's History Month, which of course it's a little bit we have spread out into the after the official Women's History Month, which feels entirely appropriate. And I am so happy to welcome you here for this event. We're calling it Examining 500 Years of Solidarity with Linda Quiquivix, who is a geographer and a seed saver based in California. She places her university training at the service of under-resourced communities in the US and Mexico and Palestine who seek clean water, land, and tools to build and strengthen their collective autonomies. She is the author of Palestine 1492, a report back, and also was part of publishing the Fourth World War, or sorry, you are the author of the Fourth World War, Zapatista Writings and Global Capitalism. And I'm so honored and grateful Dr. Kiki Vish with us here today. And you will be, I believe, hearing a bit. So you'll be talking, and then there's going to be an opportunity for us to be in discussion and in conversation. Look forward to that. So I will turn it over to you, Kiki. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me for, wow, this opportunity to workshop some ideas with you all. Some ideas that aren't really easy to workshop in a lot of movement spaces because they talk about really meta topics like, spirituality and the divine, which I think is really important. I'm going to present to you about how I engage the question of Palestine, and not just Palestine, but just the question of land liberation in a book that I just wrote that is also guided by Maya spirituality. So I'll share a PowerPoint with you. Let's see. And I think you can see that, correct? Yes. So this is the cover of the book, and on the sideways, you might recognize it as a map of Central America and the Caribbean, which is where my ancestral lands are. This is the Maya world, together with Mesoamerica. And the reason why the book has this map oriented with the east at the top is for two reasons. One of them is because in Maya geography, we begin with the east when we do our prayers. This is where the sun rises. It's the color red that signifies life and rebirth. And also because I have this map oriented with east at the top because when I was in my ancestral lands is where I got the call to go to Palestine. And so it's facing toward Palestine. And I want to zoom in a bit into this Maya compass, which is on the cover of the book, and it guides the book. Now, there's a few things about it. One of them is that all four of these points, the physical being the east, the spiritual being the west, the emotional the south, and the mental the north, all four of these make up the social. And when we do our prayers, we put our candles and our offerings in the middle. And when we do a fire ceremony, we check to see, we observe where the fire is going in what direction, where the wax is melting, where the smoke is blowing. Is it going toward the physical, spiritual, emotional, mental? Because the idea is that that's where some work is being done. And something that when I think about the modern world, or the world built by 1492, which I'll describe what I mean by that. When I think about the world that we're in, the dominant world, the colonial, capitalist, patriarchal world, racist, sexist, anti-Black world. When I think about it, I think that it is highly imbalanced in a couple of ways. And one of them is that it focuses heavily on the physical or the material, and on the rational or the mental. uh, in a way that does not allow for a balance with the emotional and the spiritual. So when we're talking about religious fundamentalisms, for example, there's an imbalance there between the logos, which is the rational, and the mythos, the more mystical. Karen Armstrong does a really great job of talking about this in her book called The Battle for God, which was published in 2000, right before 9/11, about religious fundamentalisms, which she points to beginning in 1492 with Christianity, and then with Judaism, and then with Islam. So she focused a lot on the Abrahamic faiths, although the Abrahamic faiths are not the only fundamentalist uh, movements. There's many secular movements that are fundamentalist as well, like race exclusive movements, for example, whether white, whether black, whether in anything in between, can be fundamentalist as well. So she talks about it as an imbalance between the logos, the rational, and the mythos, the mystical, in terms of, for example, how scripture is encountered. So scripture has long been metaphorical and allegorical, but with the rise of fundamentalisms and the overfocus on the logos, on the rational, it has become read literally, interpreted literally, which leads to fundamentalisms that the world can only be one way, which is what I mean by fundamentalisms, the imposition of one world at the expense of other worlds. So with the Maya altar, which in many native communities they call the medicine wheel, these are the four that make up the social, the physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental, make up the social as a whole. And something else about this Maya compass that follows and guides the book is that it doesn't just have four cardinal directions, there are seven. Along with the east, west, south, and north, in the middle, you'll see there's blue and green, and that stands for to represent the sky and the earth, which are also cardinal directions. And then the seventh one is you, is us, between the sky and the earth, and surrounded by, within, in the midst of the physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental. So there are seven directions in Maya geography that guide the book. And it's an important way to provide a corrective for colonial geography, because colonial geography often, actually always, understands that the human is separate from the earth, that humans are above nature, need to dominate nature or be dominated by nature. And so that has led to a colonial cartography that sees the earth from above and makes it so that it's an object that can be cut and owned and enslaved and destroyed. So with native geographies like Maya geography, land-based geographies, we are part of the earth, we are part of the land. And so it's a constant reminder that when we dominate the earth, when we go to war with the earth, when we make an enemy of the earth, we're making an enemy of our own selves, of our own bodies. So I also want to begin in talking about orientations and geographies and world maps with the way that the colonial geography that came out of Europe kind of got its origins. This is a world map according to the rulers of Europe, the tyrants of Europe, the above of Europe, because there is a below to Europe as well. And this is a world map before 1492 that understood that the world had three continents surrounded by an ocean, and those continents were divided by two rivers, largely the Nile, that forms the top of that T in the middle of that O of ocean, and then the Mediterranean. And the idea was that Asia, where the sun rises, is oriented at the top of the map, and at the top you can see the word Orient there, which is also where we get the term, how do we orient ourselves in space? So Asia, the Orient at the top. And what's interesting is that Europe is not a continent, but the rulers of Europe, the Europe from above, has wanted to separate itself from the rest of the world. And so, whereas Europe is just a peninsula on the western side of Eurasia, according to Europe's geographic imagination, it is separate from Asia. So it creates itself as its own continent, in opposition to, if you see at the bottom, to Africa, which is an enormous continent in its own right. And you also see in this map that there are some names underneath the names of the continent. So Asia, underneath Asia is Sem. Underneath Europe, Europa is Aphith. And underneath Africa is Ham. Now, those names were added to this map after 1492, especially in the 18th century with race science. It became very prominent, this idea that the biblical flood hero Noah had three sons who, after the flood, populated the supposed three continents. Noah's son Sem populated Asia, his son Apheth populated Europe, and his son Ham populated Africa. And there is a story that attaches to that says that Ham is the cursed son, and therefore Africa is cursed. This is something that in churches, even still today, they talk about as Africa being cursed because the cursed son of Noah populated that land. I also want to point to Sem under Asia, which is where Semite comes from, that word Semite. A Semite is meant to be a child of Sem. And within Europe, Jews within Europe, they were called Semites by the Europe from above because they believed that they did not belong in Europe, because they believed that Jews were not sons and children of Apheth, but instead children of Sem. So this map shows the racial science of not just Africa as cursed with Ham, but also Sem, that Jews belong outside of Europe. Over in Asia, they are Semites. And of course, we know that the way that Semites are, being Semitic is defined is coming from a Semitic language group, such as Aramaic, Arabic, and Hebrew. So this was a pre-1492 map that after 1492 in the 18th century had those names added. Here's a world map right after 1492, less than 100 years after. And there you see that north is now where the orientation is at the top. And we still have those three continents, Europe, Asia, Africa. And in the middle, we have Jerusalem, which is understood as the center of the world according to the European imagination, which is Christendom. The European imagination from above is Christendom and has been Christendom. You see that Rome is depicted in the clover, in the pink clover that says Europe. And what you also see in the bottom left-hand corner is a blob that says America, the New World. And that's because these lands, when they found out that we were here, these lands did not fit into this biblical geography where Jerusalem is in the center. The geography that puts Jerusalem in the center understands that Europe is the west of Jerusalem and Asia is the east of Jerusalem. So it's the reason why Europe calls itself the West, because it's to the west of Jerusalem. But maps will change after this, after 1492, because it doesn't fit this neat geography, this sacred geography that shows Jerusalem in the center of the world. Instead, what we have more dominant now are maps like this, where Europe is in the center. And Europe is in the center not only in terms of space, but also time, because that line is the Greenwich Mean Time line that all of the clocks are oriented to. This is the center of that hour, of that day. This is something that always stood out to me as strange, being from these lands, is that when we turn to the West, Asia's there, but we're forced to call Asia the East. And then when we turn to the East, Europe is there, but we're forced to call Europe the West. And I argue that's because Europe's center of the world continues to be Jerusalem, even if it tries to pretend it's secular. That's its cosmovision. And in fact, in Washington, D.C., back in April of 2024, when they were having the hearings on the encampments in Columbia University in Congress, there was a congressional representative from Georgia who said, many people think Washington, D.C. is the center of the universe, but that's not true. Jerusalem is the center of the universe. And I want to point that out because something that I learned in doing this work of accompanying the Palestinian struggle and tracing how Palestine came into this colonial purview the way that our lands have had since 1492, I learned of the centrality of Jerusalem, even among Columbus himself, which I didn't know about. This book was called Palestine 1492 because I was going to begin on October 12th, 1492, when Columbus and them first invaded the Caribbean. I found out in doing this work that earlier that same year, on January 2nd, 1492, there was an enormous event also on the Iberian Peninsula with that same Queen Isabella that sends Columbus here. And Columbus are both there in Granada, witnessing the ethnic cleansing, the final ethnic cleansing of the Iberian Peninsula. So for hundreds of years, the Catholic monarchs had been trying to push out the Muslims from Africa, the Moors, they call them, from the Iberian Peninsula. And the last battle, after centuries of war, of holy war, took place in Granada in the south of what is today Spain. And Christopher Columbus was there. This happened on January 2nd, 1492. And Columbus was there because he was waiting for Isabella to be done with the war so that he could propose to her to have him sail west to take Jerusalem next, because it was an enormous event for Christendom that the Iberian Peninsula had been ethnically cleansed of Islam. Immediately, they then started to ramp up the ethnic cleansing of Jews by forcing everybody to convert to Catholicism or leave. And this is the imposition of a fundamentalism, of the understanding that there can only be one way of being in the earth, and everyone had to conform or no longer exist in that land. So a reason why this was such an enormous event is because less than 40 years before, the Roman Empire had just fallen. Like the last seat of the Roman Empire was Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, over in what is today Turkey, over in the East Mediterranean. Constantinople had just been taken by the Ottoman Empire. And so the East was really dangerous for Christendom. And so that this had happened over in the west of Europe, it was enormous. And so what Columbus was proposing to Isabella was to have him sail west so that they can take Jerusalem next by allying with the empires of the Indies to then beat back Islam. So this book was called Palestine 1492 before I even found out that Columbus wanted Jerusalem that same year, which is why he came. Like we're always told that he came because he was greedy, they wanted riches, and that's true, but that was secondary because he genuinely believed that the world was going to end in 155 years. He wrote a book about it called the Book of Prophecies, where he said that in order for Jesus to come back, Christians have to have control of Jerusalem. And in particular, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where they say Jesus of Nazareth was entombed. And so he wanted Jerusalem next, um, and was pretty fanatic about it. And it sounds so similar to today's Christian Zionism, right? It hasn't gone away. It just looks different. So something super important to keep in mind is the centrality of Jerusalem when we're talking about Palestine. And that's something that a lot of the social justice movements who don't engage in the question of spirituality miss. You know, they miss that the October 7 operation by the resistance in Gaza was called Al-Aqsa flood, the flood of Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is the mosque that exists right now in Jerusalem, over the rock where the creation story of the Abrahamic faith begins. Mount Moriah is the rock where in the creation story of the Abrahamic faiths, Abraham is said to have almost sacrificed his son until God stepped in and saved his son. That's where the Jewish temples were built, the first and the second ones that were destroyed. And that is where the Dome of the Rock is built over. And that is a place that right now the Zionists want to demolish in order to build a third temple, which the Christian Zionists are encouraging them to, because they say that once Jews build the third temple, then Jesus will come back. Everyone will need to become Christian or die in a fiery hell, the rapture. So this is a more than 500-year long story. I started in 1492 because that's when it becomes the problem of us all, right? We are now under threat of nuclear annihilation, even just of an entire earth being uninhabitable because of these fundamentalisms. And again, we begin the story of these fundamentalisms in 1492 with the Catholic monarchs and Columbus in them. So once Columbus sails west and he bumps into us instead of the Indies, he returns to the Iberian Peninsula after his first invasion, and he tells the Portuguese king instead of Queen Isabella of Castile. And the Portuguese king says, well, those are my territories now. And Isabella gets upset. They start to fight, and the Pope steps in. The Pope steps in and says, you cannot fight. You're both Catholic monarchs. You have work to do. And the work that they believe that they were doing was saving souls by converting everybody into their world. Again, fundamentalism. So the Pope, so that the Portuguese and the Castilians don't fight, draws an imaginary line, which is understood as the first global border, the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, which was the first time that they conceived of the world as a globe and cut it in half. And said, the Pope said, Castile, Spain, you invade everything to the west of this line, and Portugal, you invade everything to the east. So if you know about the history of early African colonization, Portugal invaded and colonized a lot of the ports around Africa. And also notice that line that hits where Brazil is today. That's why Portuguese is spoken in Brazil instead of Spanish, whereas in Spanish was everything to the west. Of course, at the destruction of many other languages and many other worlds, because again, the whole point of this scheme was to impose one way on the whole world. And languages are an important way to do that, to extinguish ways of being and impose other ways of being, is by just the concepts that we even carry as possibilities in this life. From the cutting up of the globe in two, we then get more of this logic of cutting up Mother Earth again from above, right? And dividing it out into these empires. These are the viceroyalties, as Spain and Portugal called them, kind of like vice presidency, the viceroyals. They sent their mercenaries to subdue the peoples in these lands and govern. The same ones, the same generals became the governors. And these become the footprints of today's nation state. So where, in Spain, in California, Uh, we live in what is and the Viceroyalty of New Spain, what used to be the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which then became the state of Mexico, which then was reduced by these battles between the Americans and the Mexicans, or the US Americans and the Mexicans. Uh, so we also then get this same logic, then reflecting back onto Europe eventually into this idea of nation states. The Holy Roman Empire that you see here was very fragmented within, but eventually we start getting this idea, particularly with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which was a response to a 30 years religious war. We start getting this idea that territory should be respected with borders. And it really congeals with in France with the French Revolution in 1789, when the monarchy is overthrown. And then there's the problem of who's going to govern. Well, the people are going to govern. Who are the people? The nation. Who's the nation? The French. Who's the French? And then this whole long list of who's not French, right? And especially very famously our Jewish relatives, right? They didn't fit into any of these schemes, these nation state schemes. And what is a nation? What is a state? A state is the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. The nation is a supposedly homogenous group that speaks the same language, has the same history, shares the same culture, right? And the idea of a nation state is that that homogenous nation, that homogenous group, is going to govern the state, the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And so there's this constant tension over who the nation is, because they're trying to force a homogenous way of being on everybody, and it doesn't work. It never works. Like, there's tendencies toward it, and it's constantly being challenged. So what we get at this moment is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe starts to congeal as nation states that understand land and territory as a container that has neat borders and a homogenous people inside. And the rule of international law number one is that you do not, if you're ruling France, for example, or any other country, you don't cross the line and get into anybody else's business. You just rule what's in your business. It's a plantation, basically. Everyone's an overseer of a plantation, right? And that's what these borders are for, so that the plantation overseers don't fight each other. They're not for us. They're not for the land. These borders are for those above, so that they can have peace while they can conduct war down below to control that territory. And we see this very clearly with the idea of the nation state of Germany. The Holy Roman Empire dissolves and eventually becomes a state of Germany. The Holy Roman Empire was the first Reich. Reich in Deutsch means empire. The state of Germany became the second Reich. In 1871 is when it was invented. In 1871, the state of Germany was invented, and it wasn't an empire, and it wished to be so. It called a conference with the other European empires to see how they could cut up Africa so that Germany can have some empire too. And this is called the Scramble for Africa. It began in 1884 in Berlin. It lasted 30 years throughout Europe, because the whole point was for them to peacefully assemble around a table and see who is violently being able to control and subdue the land in Africa. That's how you would be able to get a piece of Africa. So Africa ends up getting cut up, right? And if you see in the middle, King Leopold II got as his own personal plantation the Congo River watershed, right in the middle. So we can't understand the genocide in the Congo today without understanding this history, right? And a lot of these colonial boundaries become the footprints of the nation states that arise with the United Nations after the Second World War, where the whole world is cut up into nation states, and they're only valid if the United Nations recognizes you. But not even just the General Assembly of the United Nations, the violent part of the United Nations, the Security Council. because the General Assembly, for example, has recognized the state of Palestine for a long time, but there's no state of Palestine because it requires violence in order for it to be a reality. Again, a state is the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. After the cutting up of Africa, we get the cutting up of the Eastern Mediterranean, which includes Palestine and what becomes Lebanon and Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait. This is a secret agreement between Britain and France. The idea is for there to be a pipeline between the Mediterranean Sea and the Gulf of the Persian Gulf, and that's still something that they've been fighting for to build, but the Palestinians have gotten in the way. I'll show you a map of what the nation state borders of today look like in the region. Let's see. Now, these lines come from post World War II, and many of them, all of them, were puppet regimes that were implanted by the Europeans. Some of them were overthrown by the local peoples, only to be implanted again. Except for Palestine, that has still been the big question, because the idea was to create the state of Israel there so that Jews who did not fit in this nation state carving of Europe could now have a nation state of their own. The Zionist movement, which is the movement, the fundamentalist Jewish movement, so it's a Judaism from above. When it was first coming up with the idea of a nation state for Jews, it didn't care where it was going to be. There was whole conversations about it being in Argentina and in Africa also, when the cutting up of Africa was taking place, that it would be like in Eastern Africa near where Uganda is today. But Palestine won out. And so the idea that the Zionist movement had, the way they sold it to the European empires, was that Israel would be a drop of civilization in a sea of barbarism, and what's called today like a unsinkable aircraft carrier for the West, basically a military base, right? While it also has a lot of spiritual connections, so it's material and it's also spiritual. It's not just one or the other. I think that we have a tendency to see that analyses come from just one way, one end or another end when it comes to Palestine, that it's religious, or that it's not religious at all and it's just about oil or something like that, right? Material. It's both. It's more than just both. So what we get, of course, with Palestine is its disappearance. I go through it in detail in the book, and something that I want to point out is this last panel on the top. We have also Israel occupying parts of Syria, the Golan Heights, which is really important to never lose sight of, that the Golan Heights has been occupied since 1967. And now as we're seeing Israel trying to occupy the south of Lebanon, right? Why is that? Well, if you look at this map of the region from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, it's the land that Israel wants to create its entire state. Israel has never defined its borders because it's still expanding. So the idea of Greater Israel or Eretz Israel is that this is the ancestral land of Abraham from the river Euphrates all the way to the Nile. And you see this map in the patches of the uniforms of the Israeli soldiers, for example. I've also seen them, this map, quite a bit in the podiums, in front of the podiums of Israeli politicians. I also want to point out that 2 weeks before the October 7th Tufan operation, this was Netanyahu lying to the UN General Assembly with some maps. This was Palestine in 1948, but it called it Israel in 1948, and then made a map of all of the friendly countries now to Israel, basically the countries that have forsaken the Palestinian struggle, which we have Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE. And he takes his Sharpie and draws a pipeline going into the Mediterranean, right? with the idea 2 weeks before October 7, when nobody was talking about Palestine anymore and it looked like Palestine was a lost struggle now, this is what he was planning, right? And was so certain of it. And then October 7 happened. So I want to move on to a more metaphysical map of how I see this colonial geography taking place, which again is not just colonial. Here is how I see us mapped onto the world vis-a-vis each other. I see that whenever we meet, encounter, difference each other, we are encouraged to rank each other according to everything: how we look, right? How we dress, how we speak, the kind of education we've had, the kind of car we drive, the kind of house we live in. It's endless. We're constantly ranking each other. We learn about it in school, actually, the way that we're ranked as students with an A, B, C, D, F, right? We're constantly taught to rank into a standard. And that standard is a standard set by those who make their lives by crushing others, by those above. So the haves and the have-nots is something that we hear a lot about. The haves have at the expense of the ones who don't have. It's a high imbalance. So how we were talking about the imbalance between, for example, the physical and the spiritual, or the rational and or the logos and the mythos. This is also an imbalance of those who make their lives off the backs of others. And so, for example, here, what I see as an example is our Jewish relatives' liberation project called Zionism, which is not a liberation project. What it is coming out of a real necessity of oppression, but asking those above, the oppressors, the empires, for a seat at the table. If you hang out with politicians, and I hope you don't, you often hear them say you're either at the table or you're on the menu, right? And they're not questioning, why do we even have those two horrible choices? You're either at the table cannibalizing or you're being eaten, right, on the menu, right? And so what I see Zionism be is an example. It's not the only, because this is an example for all of our movements. Empire sets us up this way, where we have only two options. We are either above or below. We're either making our lives, and our lives are smooth, but they come at the expense of the below, and those are other people, and it's of course Mother Earth, other lives, other living beings in planet Earth. And what we're taught to do is go up the ladder, lift the family up from poverty. There's all of these metaphors of going up, right? And then we don't question, wait a minute, what's the ethics of that? Because when we go up, there's still a foundation of who we're crushing, right? And so this is assimilation also, for example. This is multicultural neoliberalism, right? Like demanding to have like a bunch of different color faces up in high places, but there's still a below, right? There's still a below. And this is the relation, not just of colonialism, it's also the relation of patriarchy, right? That there are some genders that are above other genders, right? That, for example, the males have all the rights and the non-males have all the responsibilities, right? And so sadly, what we see from a lot of our movements is that we're so stuck in this trap that we think that this is just the way the world works, that then we want to reverse the positions of domination, right? Like we have some feminist movements that want women to dominate men. And they might call it a matriarchy, but we need to be very careful when we say when we define matriarchy. Does it mean that the feminine, that the mothers are above crushing others, or does it mean that the mothers are at the service, right, of the whole community? We need to be very clear, because we're so used to an above below configuration, right, of race relations. Like white people who are white adjective, just white adjective, right? In this configuration, their white adjectiveness makes them white, I'm the boss. It makes them a structural position in a noun in addition to an adjective, right? And so then we need to split that off. We need to just be our beautiful adjectives, right? We need to we need to get away from this configuration into a more side by side by side by side by side configuration. So instead of in the above below, for example, which is the master slave uh, uh, relation at the root, the above below is a master slave. The master makes their lives at the expense of the enslaved. What if the enslaved doesn't want to be the master, doesn't want to play this game of reversing the positions of domination? What if the enslaved wants to run away? So the enslaved runs away, which means there's no more master. There's just a regular person who's not a master. They're just a regular person. But if that regular person wants to be a master, they're going to want to catch the runaway and stick them back under their boot, right? And this is why we need to understand that there's the violence of the above below, and there's also self-defense so that the enslaved can stay outside of the above below relation, right? And not be caught. Like there needs to be a way to prevent that capture. And the side by side by side, instead of a standard, for example, with rights, with citizenship, in order to have rights, we have to have, we have citizenship, which is a standard. Like you have to be born in this certain place, you have to speak the language, etc. And now like you being born is like not even a thing according to the United States. Like they're trying to take away that piece, right? But there's a checklist, right? The moment we introduce a standard for equality, we've introduced inequality. What about we're equal because we're different? We're already equal. We begin with that. And difference is our power. So, for example, in Native communities and the Maya communities, when children are born, when children are little and they're being raised, they're observed to see what their special gifts are, what makes them different from every other child, right? And how to help them develop those gifts so that they can contribute them to the community as a whole in this really greater thing. I think a lot about a garden like the milpa. The milpa is the way that we say the Three Sisters garden, which is the corn, the beans, and the squash together. So the corn is planted together with beans and together with squash. The corn is the leading plant in the milpa. It's the basis of Mesoamerican diet, tortillas, for example. It's the beans, they wrap around like a trellis around the corn, and beans, by being legumes, they bring nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil. So they put fertilizer into the soil, and squash crawl on the soil. And with their big leaves, they protect the soil from drying up, from other weeds. So the corn is known as the leader, the beans are known as the giver, and the squash as the protector. Three very, very different plants, but their difference is their power when they're organized in a milpa, which is so different from how we see agriculture being done in the dominant world through industrial agriculture, where there's just one plant and it has to be the same. I worked in a farm, organic farm, and we were trying to sell our carrots to the schools, and they rejected them because they were all different sizes and they didn't fit into the machine that needed to cut the carrots, So there's like incentives for this sameness, same. And everything that's different has to be herbicided or pesticided, right? Cited, killed, right? So rather than that above below configuration, which you can see even in the way that we grow our own food, right? How about we go to the side by side? And this is where I think a lot about a world where many worlds fit, a world where all worlds fit. That how are we going to get to that? We need to think about what are worlds, right? And how do we actually practice that to go beyond just a theory for it? I think I'll pause there. Well, actually, I want to share just one thing. I think this is really important. The next slide is, I have been inspired a lot by the Maya Zapatistas who are in southern Mexico, in Chiapas. And what they say, what their strategy is to lead by obeying. This is how they circulate power in a side by side way, rather than an above below. And what this means is that anyone in a leadership position has to obey and not command. Obey whom? Obey the people, the assembly, an actual assembly of people who strategize. They need to serve, not serve themselves. They need to represent, not supplant. Supplant is like to replace the word rather than represent the word. To build, not destroy. To propose, not impose. So, like if they have an idea, they say, hey, what do you think about this idea? Rather than saying, this is what we're going to do. To convince, not defeat. So, this is like when, with differences, it's about convincing, not defeating. Defeating, when I think about that, I think about like the Charlie Kirk, Hassan Piker kind of way of speaking, that they just want to like defeat the opponent rather than trying to convince each other as to how we want to live. And to go below, not go above. And so if you notice that everything on the left side is the side by side relation, the way of being, and everything on the right side is the above below, right? So there's like these ways of just principles. These are 7 principles that remind them of the path of yes and the path of no, because we need to have both. We can't just have a no, and we can't just have a yes. We need both. We need to have an ethics. And I think that that's what theologians, anyone working on the question of metaphysics, I think is better prepared to help us with this question of ethics. How do we live, right? How do we treat each other? How do we relate to life? How do we relate to death? How do we relate to difference? Because I think our task in the face of all of these fundamentalisms is precisely this: to build a world where all worlds fit, to figure out concretely how we're going to share the earth with all our difference. Meaning, not what are the similarities that we have, but what are those things we have in common, right? And right away, what we have in common is we all need clean water. How are we going to be governed by clean water, for example, rather than the United Nations, right? How are we going to be governed by clean air and clean soil and by healthy relationships for a future, for a massive future where life on the planet with human beings can still thrive? So those kinds of big questions I think are really necessary right now and super urgent. So I'll stop sharing. I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of this.
Thank you so much, Kiki. This is just beautiful, 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 beautiful. It's so wonderful to see you speak, and so glad that we have this opportunity to be in conversation now with you. So we have some time to really get. We have a little more than 30 minutes together with Kiki, and I would love to make some space for comments, questions, exploration. Let's be in conversation.
I noticed, here, Karen Villanueva, should I have raised my hand first? Sorry.
Go ahead, Karen. Go ahead.
I noticed that the division of Africa, of Central America, excuse me, South America, etc., that these divisions weren't equal. And I wonder who determined or what determined what people's got more. For example, I was looking at Italy at first and I said, well, I don't see Italy getting any part of these peoples where I know that Ethiopia was, dominated by the Italians. So could you speak about that a little bit, how they determined that? Thank you, Linda.
Yeah, of course. The bit that I know, so much of it had to do with who could dominate the land, which one of the European powers had the type of arms and troops and just firepower that could really do it. In the case of King Leopold and the Congo, that area was not well known. The map right before that, I have it on my wall. It says vast regions unknown. And so King Leopold was like happy to help fund explorations there. And of course, it turns out that the Congo is the most mineral rich area of all of Africa, right? Also, really interesting to point out is that these borders, they were super uneven. And just because they were determined and at one point didn't mean that they couldn't change when the violence changed by other European powers. So European powers in non-Europe were totally free to take everything by force. As if they could hold it by force, then it was theirs, and it didn't matter if they competed with each other. So there was a lot of that, like how Hispaniola, Saint-Domingue, like it becomes French and Spanish where it was just French, so there's a lot of these kind of like exchanges through piracy, through illegal means. But the thing is that lawlessness is what reigned in non-Europe. Lawfulness was for Europe. So there was an exportation of violence to non-Europe that for Europe was necessary because they understood that the world is just dog eat dog. You're either above or below, and that's just the way the world is. So everybody is an enemy, right? Like that's like kind of like an illness that the European tyrants have, that the stranger is always an enemy rather than a mystery, right? And so for them, they needed to have a very clear separation of the geography of peace and the geography of war. And Europe was going to be the geography of peace, which is why whenever there's a world war, it has to happen to Europeans, right? Even though the whole world's on fire since 1492, right? Like right now, people are talking about, are we in World War III yet? They're waiting for Europe to call it. And they're like, well, it must have happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. But what we say is World War III already happened. It's called the badly named Cold War because it was not cold for the rest of the world. It was cold for NATO and for the USSR. But again, they call it a world war when the war comes into the geography it's not meant to, which is Europe, right? And that is with a lot of like the Nazi philosophers, with the creation of the League of Nations and the United Nations, they were really upset at this idea of a universal human equality because they're like, where's the line where there's going to be peace and where there's going to be war? Now there's going to be war everywhere, right? And if we see that the way that the United Nations works, like the Geneva Conventions and humanitarian law applies to Europeans. The International Criminal Court applies to non-Europeans, right? Like, and so it continues being this way. It's just a really big facade. But the main logic is that they understand that peace needs to exist somewhere and war must be exported somewhere else. Thank you for that, Karen.
I'm seeing a note. Anjali, I wonder if you might share. You have a question, and then we'll go to V and Diana.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this amazing, very expansive discussion. I really appreciated like I was reading. I'll just read that out. The historical context of the presentation and the how you locate it in this very expansive geopolitical context. I really wanted, I would love the more sort of examination of how we can apply some of these tenets of leadership, especially in the last slide that you offered. I mean, it's so needed and it's so starkly different than what we are seeing in dominant culture everywhere. So I was wondering, what are some of the ways in which we can apply that in smaller communities and organizations, especially when it is located in larger context, which is not that way?
Yeah, so good. Thank you for that, Anjali. I've been thinking a lot about this question in terms of like what is like the root in the most abstract way, because our communities are all so different, right? But what is a shared commonality that can get us to a more side-by-side relation? And I think the key to that is nurturing a culture where we understand each other as having different gifts, right? That we speak about each other's gifts. Like maybe we don't know what our gifts are, but like our friends know what our gifts are, or our family knows what our gifts are, right? What makes us different? Because it's when we are not in our gifts, when we haven't done that internal work of like, who am I and what I want to be in this world and how I want to contribute to this greater world called the earth, right? Called other humanity. When we don't do that, we're just going to, by default, try to reach that standard of above. And it's trying to reach a standard that keeps us in this circulation of power that is this above below, right? When we can have a culture that tries to emphasize each other's gifts and our gifts. And I think like in the classroom, I think about that too, because there's so many, like, especially like in a university setting, there's so many constraints because folks are trying to get a degree. And in order to get a degree, there's like the accreditation institute. So you have to write X amount of words and whatever, right? And have grades, which are horrible because again, the ranking of A, B, C, D, right? If we can be clear about all of those restraints and just be real, maybe we can carve out within a classroom, right, other ways of being that we still have some autonomy for while we still have to meet these strictures. And some of those are talking more about what makes us different. What is it that we wish to do in the world, right? And nurture our gifts that way rather than trying to reach a standard. We could reach a standard tactically as a tool for the degree, as long as we don't think that that's the definition of us, right? So at the bigger root level, I think that that's the key, is that we have a culture where we're focusing on how difference is our power rather than trying to meet a standard.
Thank
I
you.
hope that helps.
Yeah, no, it's great. I like how you said that we have to be very clear about what our restrictions are. I think that transparency is really important to kind of always name and bring to the surface. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I'll add to, I didn't show it here, but there's a chapter called strategy and tactics. And I think it's really important to understand the difference between the two. So we kind of like venture into Chess and the Art of War by Sun Tzu, because that was a text that is a text of military strategy, and the soldiers were never allowed to see it because they were only taught tactics. Tactics are like the methods, right? But the strategy is how we position ourselves in this greater battle and how things are moving. But only generals and kings were allowed to see that because they didn't want the soldiers overthrowing the generals and the kings, right? And when I think about us and like our movement spaces, we're doing tactics all the time without a strategy, right? Without stepping outside. And I think that just being conscious that we can have a strategic position that is outside of above below over to the side by side, right? Where we want to all be, and difference is our power. And then we can tactically engage in the above below as long as it's advancing the strategy outside to nourish that world where many worlds fit, to diminish the world where only one world can fit. How do we tactically engage it? We can pull resources, right? We can do some harm reduction. We can do some subversion, some inspiring. There's a lot of people in there who have no idea that there could even be something else, right? So tactically engage it, but every tactic needs to be able to be disposed of the moment that it's hindering the strategy. That's how you know it's a tactic and not a strategy, is that you can dispose of it like that. So that's how I like to talk about it, is a strategic position outside the dominant world where we know that's not me, that's not us, that's not what we want, and it's real. So how are we going to engage it, right?
Thank you. I love that so much. V, you are next, and then Deanna. And then I might put myself in line after that, but please keep raising your hands.
Thank you, Anna. Good to meet you, Kiki. I'm good to be here with all of us. I'm an anthropology student, and I also work for CIIS. And I think I'm reluctant to ask my question because the conversation that we just started, prompted by Angela's question, in my view, is more important and more relevant. My question is a bit about the geography and history again, which is as relevant. But I can't miss this opportunity to ask you to highlight a little bit the history of struggles and histories of solidarities with the not often mentioned others, which are Eastern Europeans and Orthodox Christians, and many churches over there, and the cultures, very old cultures, and many different forms of cultures and engagement with life and earth that are playing a part in the in the current moment. I mean, we just mentioned, Russia and Ukraine and Cold War and stuff like that. When I was as you were presenting your maps, I really am not trying to say what about us. I'm just trying to say you said, there's so many differences, and there are gifts of being different and united in that. So I'm not trying to say what about us, what about Eastern Europeans. You hear my accent, but I would like you to highlight a bits and parts that might be relevant for the conversation today.
I
Thank you
love
so
that.
much. Yeah.
It's okay to ask what about us.
It is, but and not in that sense, just in the sense of conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the question because I didn't know how to talk about Christianity more than anything because I was in a fight with Jesus. And I have a story in the book, the first chapter, and I'll put a link to the book that you can read it online for free. You can order it if you like a hard copy. You can get it from your library or request it. And in the first chapter is my journal entries from when I was living in Palestine in 2010, 2011, and I was living in Bethlehem, which is largely Christian. And there was triplets that lived on my street. I lived on Star Street, like right on the path toward the Nativity Church. And I was like totally going at Palestine secular, except I was living in Bethlehem and I'm studying Arabic in Jerusalem. I'm like, this isn't making sense. I'm reading the Bible because I have to learn the maps of Palestine. And so these triplets, they were 10-year-old identical triplet boys who were named Musa, Isa, and Muhammad. So the names of the three prophets of Moses, Judaism, Jesus, Christianity, Muhammad, Islam. And I never saw all three of them. I only saw like one or two. So I didn't even believe that they were triplets. And one of them would always throw trash at me whenever we would walk. Like we'd have like this like tense relation. And then like 9 months later, I saw all three of them one night coming at me. And it kind of felt like a dream. And one of them came up to me to give me something, and I thought it was going to be trash. And it was a flower. And I was like, oh, thank you. I introduced myself. His name was Mohammed. It's the Mohammed triplet. And I asked him, where did you get the flower? And he said, from the trash. There's all these flowers on the ground. And I start to crack up. And I introduced myself to the other brothers. We chat a little bit. And then I head out and I say, thank you. And as I'm walking away, one of the brothers picks up a bunch of flowers from the ground and throws them at my back. And I turn around and it's Jesus. It was Isa. And I was like, oh my God, it's been Jesus who's been throwing trash at me and making faces in Bethlehem, And I was like, I realized I was mad at Jesus, but I didn't know Jesus could be mad at you too. Like it was me being unable to reconcile Jesus because of Columbus and them forcing Jesus on everybody here, right? And so what happens after he throws those bunch of flowers at me, his brother Mohammed scolds him and picks another flower up and gives it to me. So now I have two flowers and Mohammed made it better. And so I realized many years later, I reflect on that story. And I was realizing that it came at this moment where I was learning from the Christian anarchists and the Christian Marxists, remembering that Jesus was against empire, that there's a Jesus from above and a Jesus from below. And I was forced with just the Jesus from above, even though, of course, I heard all of these amazing stories, but they were never emphasized that he was against the Roman Empire, all of empire. I met Richard Horsley, who became a great mentor. He wrote this book called Jesus and Empire in 2003 against the war in Iraq and Bush, his whole crusader discourse, Jesus and Empire. And it was like such a conceptual healing for me that there's a below and an above to spirituality. There's a Christianity from below that's more land-based, right? Kind of like how you're mentioning, Violeta. And a Christianity from above that wants to impose, and a Judaism from below and a Judaism from above, and an Islam from below and Islam from above, and a Marxism from below and a Marxism from, and an anarchism from below and feminism from below. Like, these are just tendencies I feel are just part of being human. that we tend toward control and imposition, and we tend toward cooperation, right? And sharing. And the point is, what kind of society are we going to build that favors toward those things about us that we want to be more like, those human tendencies or that human nature? Because the society that we're in right now, it favors toward sociopathy in that way, that it's against empathy, right? It's just about yourself, caring about just yourself. And so it emphasizes those tendencies about us that are really harmful. So how do we emphasize those tendencies that are more healing? And I feel like, from my experience in Palestine, Eastern Christianity has a lot more to say about the Christianity from below than does the Western Christianity, although I don't want to just block out all of that, because there's a Western Christianity from below as well. And there's also an Eastern Christianity from above. So I think that land-based movements are like probably the ones that can most readily invite us into these worlds from below, precisely because of that interconnectedness with the land. It already puts us down below, rather than like that colonial geography of thinking that we're separate from the land, right? That we can dominate the land. I hope that helps, Violetta. I'd love to learn
Thank
more.
you. Thank you. Thank you. We can talk some more. I do really appreciate your take and perspective on, on entities above and entities below. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anna, go ahead. You're next.
Good morning. I just want to say, I have so much more to ask, but I think Anjali's question really touched or opened up or touched the heart of what I was wanting to understand. But since I have an opportunity, I want to just say thank you for being here. I watched a YouTube video of you speaking of your book, I think when it first came out, and so to see to have the opportunity to see you live, thank you for your labor. And I was having this little chuckle with myself as you were responding to the most recent question, because Anjali's question was like kind of around like in action. How does this look in action? And then the next question was like more like contextual, expansive. And my question's much more. So there is this natural like in and out, opening and closing in order to digest it. So if we can go back into the practice, um, I'm really as a clinician and as a instructor, I'm often struggling with holding this, taking in and learning this complexity around power, domination, colonialism, how to bring that into the clinical setting when that isn't the center of what we're doing, right? I'm cultivating clinicians, therapists, clinicians, how to bring this in, as you were saying, understanding the strategy, not just the tactics or methods, or changing the culture in the classroom. I just don't know if you have more to say to that, because that is the grappling. And I'd also say there's also an isolation in that, like how to have these conversations like this in order to move into tactics in the classroom. If you have anything to offer, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that. I would love a collection of all of this. I have just a tiny bit that I can offer. Maybe we should crowdsource these examples, because I think that they are really helpful. I mean, I have a couple examples just from my experience, and I think that and I'll show them right now. And what brings them together, I think, is that it's reading power. And I think how energy is flowing, right? Is energy flowing above, below? Is it flowing side by side? And so I have two very concrete examples of how I've done this. And I'll go back to my PowerPoint. And in that chapter, strategy and tactics, we play chess. And I got this from when I was teaching a graduate seminar many years ago that was looking at space and capital, and it was looking at the space of chess versus the space of Go, which is a different game, but we'll just look at chess. And so a chessboard And it doesn't matter if you play or not, but just like the point is that a chessboard is a game of war. It's dog eat dog. The whole point of chess is you have to take the other side's king and not have your king taken, and everybody can die. It doesn't matter. Like the king is the piece that's the most valuable, so everybody can die. And there's like, this is the setup. There's like the monarchy on the back row, and then the pawns in the front row, which is a lot like war. Like who gets sent to the front lines? It's usually people who are the poorest, like under resourced, people of color, non-white people, right? And their dream is to reach the other side of the board, because then they can become whatever piece they want except the king. So many of them choose to be the queen, because the queen is the most powerful of the chessboard. So all of these pieces are given points according to how much they can move, and the queen can move the most, so she's the most powerful, right? So again, like the point is to have the pawns go first. They're the least valuable. They're worth only 1 point each, and they can die so that the rest of the pieces can do their work. And so of course the king can survive. So it's very much a game of war. And what I've done is I've turned that into a remix. I've equalized the power. So the whole monarchy together, they make up 32 points. The queen is 10 points. Sometimes she's 9 points, depending on what part of the world you're in. The king is 0. So if you look at the top row, that is 5 is the rook, 3 is the knight, 3 points is the bishop, 0 is the king, 10 is the queen, 3 again the bishop, 3 again the knight, 5 again the rook. Together, they're 32 points. Now, if you equalize the power between them and play 32 pawns who make up 32 points versus this row, and notice that that row doesn't have any pawns in front of it. It doesn't have a front line to sacrifice. If you play this, the king gets wrecked. You can beat the monarchy like this. And it's about us changing our relationship to each other, right? The pawns, we are the weakest pieces. And if we take care of each other, the way that we can win as pawns is if we stick together, right? Because when we stick together, we can defend each other. And that is like one of the big, I have a chess coach who we're kind of like analyzing this, and he says it's true about chess that the points are not the only thing. It's also the amount of times that you can appear. So like 2 rooks, 5 and 5, are more powerful than 1 queen, who is 10, according to certain formations. So that's one way, and that's just like questioning how power is laid out. Like it's, let's question it and let's remix it and see what happens, right? And so then it can also add to more conversations. What happens when the pawn goes to the other side and becomes a queen? Are they going to be an oppressor? Are they going to be a Queen Isabella fundamentalist? Which, by the way, the queen in chess was put on the board 500 years ago, modeled after Queen Isabella. That's a fun fact. The way that then this can work is by having us all think about what happens if a pawn hits the other side and becomes a queen. Will they be a matriarchy in the way that they're going to oppress, or a matriarchy in the way that they're going to serve the rest of the people, right? So that's one example. Another example, I don't have it here. Oh, I wish I did. But another example is when I mapped Ida Camp, Ida refugee camp, and I've shown this in other videos before, where I made a GIS, a very mathematical map of Ida Camp at the request of the refugees in the camp. And I was showing them the streets because I had traced it from above, from an aerial photograph. And I asked them, are my streets right? And they said, yes, but the rooftops are also streets. When we're in curfew, when we can't use the streets, we have to jump roof to roof to pass food, medicine, news, that sort of thing. So I like having the side-by-side of my professional map next to the rooftops as streets map, to show that people make space all the time. They don't need the professional to come and tell them where the streets are, like they make their own geography. So it shows like that there's power in everyday life. So those are just examples of like how, from my own encounters, I have seeing how I wanted to highlight how power is already functioning as a side by side, or can be made to function as a side by side. So I think it would be really cool to collect examples of how everyone does this in their own corners of the earth, right? To have more examples. So thank you for that. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in myself, and then I see Alka and Elise. I'm loving this so much. This is incredible. And I wanted to say sort of two things that I'll try to keep brief. One is my work is on aging, critical studies of aging, and I just keep thinking about the way that you're bringing in these sort of metaphysics of personhood and how we value each other, and like what is sort of assumed as valuation, and that when we, meaning in the system that we tend to be brought up in, we tend to not value children until, or we only value them as future adults who can participate in this capitalist system, and value always, as yours is, about power and capital and domination, and this, and the way that you speak this over under, it's like children are the under, and then they become over, and then we fight like hell as we age to not go back under, to not be in the below again. And what I love what you're doing, because I think you named so clearly about the sort of diversity, neoliberal diversity sort of invisibilize it. It's not that we then all get to, Dana Walrath writes about this a little bit in terms of aging, but it's, the goal is when we see the way that you're showing so beautifully that if we can only imagine over and under, then it's always fighting to get over. But that what you're doing here, and I think it's so, I'm so excited about having you here in this women's spirituality program. And it's something you and I spoke about a little bit, that metaphysics undergirds all of this. And it's so, and I think sometimes when people think about women's spirituality or any of these spaces, we're a program that really centers activism, social justice, and brings together with spirituality. But sometimes there can be a stereotype that sort of imagining that like the spirituality can sort of feed us so that we can go fight. But that what you're doing here is so in alignment with showing sort of that it's actually metaphysics are undergirding all of this. And when we imagine the value of a person through these lenses that we've been handed, that is 500 more years old, we are actually already involved and part of a metaphysical system. And that one of the really gorgeous but most essential parts is not just reevaluating. I think in a lot of our social science programs, I was trained as an anthropologist. It's not just understanding power, but understanding the metaphysics that are undergirding what sort of is the engine of that power or the justification of it. And I just love so much the way that you're bringing these together and sort of cracking it open. And then we get to begin, once we see it, then what is the otherwise? What is the, and yeah, so power, I just thank you so much. So powerful.
No, thank you so much for that, Anna. I've been thinking a lot about like this in terms of myself, like how was it that I could accompany the Palestinian struggle for so long and completely like willfully ignore the question of religion, right? Quote unquote religion. And I started to think a lot about this term religion and this term secular. And actually, Muslim scholars are probably some of the best critics of the secular. And what they've helped me look at, not just them, but a lot of their work has helped a lot of us, is understand that these two terms come at the same time. They're inventions at the same time, where the secular becomes the economic, the political, science, right? So it's value free. It has no ethics, no matter, right? It just is. You don't question it. And then you go have your conversations with God in this thing called religion over there in the private sphere. So it separates the metaphysical critique, right, from those spheres, economy, science, politics, so that we don't have to question them. They do have a metaphysics, but we're just not encouraged at all to even question it, right? Whereas we have our questions about life over here in this private sphere. And And so how can we get back to a more integrated way of understanding ourselves in the world? And I think that because there's still such an insistence on the secular, and it makes, I mean, I understand it very well. There's a lot of trauma when it comes to this religion and spirit and institutionalized faiths. I think that ethics is probably like the common way that we can get at these questions, that bring in the metaphysical too, because unlike morality, like morality is about like what we should be doing every day, what's right and wrong every day. Ethics is like how we want to relate, how we want to live. So yeah, thank you for that. I think it's super necessary, whatever it is that we call it, spirituality, ethics, religion, philosophy, metaphysics, as long as we're talking about how we're going to share the earth together with all our difference.
Thank you. Yeah. Alka and then Elise.
Hey, Alka.
Hi, thank you so much. I learn so much every time I listen to you. So, I'm a faculty member here in the Women's Spirituality program, and one of my areas of focus is on animal ethics. And I often think about how one of the most fundamental above below distinctions we have in our world is that between the human and non-human world. And so for me, and I don't know that there is a really a fully ethical way to live in the system and to still eat, right? And I am a vegan. I'm not that I know that there are complexities there and that there's still exploitation in the plant foods and so on and so forth. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on how living in urban environments, how do we walk side by side with the animal and world of nature rather than have this relationship of domination?
So good, Alka. Thank you for that. So there's two things there, right? And one is eating, which
Hmm.
at like the highest level, that's what brings us all together. That common verb is to eat. We have to eat, right? And what makes us different in the categorization from plants is that plants can produce their own food, not totally, but a lot of their own food with the sun, right? Through photosynthesis. And we can't. So we need to eat other life in order to live, right? Which is already like a very quick move toward an above below, unless we have an ethics to that. And that's why we need to have an ethics on how are we going to eat where we're not making our lives at the destruction of other lives, like in the bigger scheme of things, right? How can we eat where it can be regenerative rather than extractive, right? Which is what a lot of land-based societies out of necessity have to think about, out of necessity being that this is where they get their sustenance and where future generations will get their sustenance. So it has to be regenerative. So one, like we need to have a culture where we think about time beyond our own lives, right? Which is with modernity, with 1492, usually like the calendar ends when we die. And that's why everyone's so afraid of death. They're terrified of death, right? It's like it's over, without seeing that there's an inheritance that we're leaving that allows us to live on in a different way. So then to eat is, it's a massively ethical question that we need to figure out. And in the context then of the second part, the urban, that's already a huge issue because within capitalism, we're living in urban existence, most of us, because we've been removed from the land. We've had land taken away from us. And so now we're forced to have money in order to buy food, right? In order to eat, in order to have shelter. We have to pay for our shelter now. We have to pay for everything that Mother Earth has provided our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years, right? And millions of years before that, our pre-ancestors. So we need to figure out how we're going to be side by side between city and countryside, just in general. And I think that the food question, how we eat, is probably the best way to get there, because it's something that we all have in common. We all have to figure this out, right? How are we going to make it so that in a city where we don't know where our water comes from or where our waste goes, that we become more conscious of where our water is coming from and where our waste is going, like how our existence living in an urban context is regenerating the earth rather than extracting from the earth, because it's really horrendous. Like I live near Los Angeles, and so like just knowing how many worlds have been destroyed so that Los Angeles can have water, how many villages have been destroyed, how many lakes have dried, you know, it's horrifying. And if we really want to get to this point where we do need justice for all of us and existing with all of us and not having the above below of the human non-human, right? How do we have a side by side? We really need to rethink how we're living, and it does get down to our lifestyle. So I understand very much the urge to want to be vegan, especially in this context, because it seems like it's like the thing that we can actually contribute to it in our own individual spiritual lives, which is super, super important. Just to get through every day in this world that is so violent. Yeah. So thank you for that. I do think if we can really get to this where we can think about the city being in side-by-side relation to the countryside, I think that we'll move very far, because right now, a lot of our movements, although they're anti-capitalist, have no idea how to live without capitalism, right? How do we learn to live without capitalism? We can start now. We may not be able to do it fully in our lives, or maybe we will because it's all going to fall apart, but we better start, so that way it's easier for the next generation, so that they don't have to, while always having that consciousness of the reason why us as the ancestors of the future generations needed to make this break. We need to start learning to live without capitalism because it's harming us in all kinds of ways. And we're not in control of it. So we can be made to suffer so easily if something goes wrong.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it, your framing. Thank you.
Thank you, Alka.
Elise. Oh, yeah. And I'll just mark, no rush. We started a tiny bit late. If you're okay, are you okay to continue a few more minutes, Kiki? Okay, wonderful. So we'll continue a few more minutes and then we'll close. But thank you, Elise, for your patience. You're up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. And I just want to say this is my first opportunity hearing you speak, Linda, and I'm very moved and inspired and blown away both by what you presented and how. I really appreciated your kind of slowness, like the thoughtfulness, because there's a lot. and I don't really know where my original question is still living within me, because there's been such rich discussion since it first formed, but it was around the Zapatistas, because their work has deeply influenced me as a person and in my work in the world. I'm a women's spirituality PhD student. I could say that. I'm Armenian. So many of the kind of geographical and geopolitical elements, the historical elements, I feel pretty close to, that you were speaking to today. One of the things that stood out to me when you were speaking were just the hints of side-by-sideness that were possible in the past, that are possible now. And particularly what came to mind was around the Zapatistas now, like what they've been doing for the last 20 years, and being very intentional about invoking solidarity, inviting solidarity, and continuing to learn and grow, like questioning their own missteps at times. I had the chance to go to Chiapas once upon a time, and strolled through one of the caracoles and saw murals commemorating when people from Palestinian movement, Kurdish movement had come. And so I guess my question now is just, I was wondering if you could speak to this element of solidarity, because like the side-by-sideness as a principle, across movements they may not even know about one another. Like, but there is all this, cross-pollinating happening around the world. It's wonderful, but I think there's still such a sense of aloneness at times in a lot of shared struggles. Anyway, I was just wondering if you could speak to this element, or what comes up for you now in hearing these words.
Thank you for that. You're making me think of, yeah, something that I've been thinking about for a while, and it's kind of hard to talk about, this question of solidarity, and especially like with a movement like the Zapatistas or movements like Palestinians, coming from a context like the United States that has relative peace, right? And so it kind of likes to think that this is what everyone else should have, right? Yes, everyone should have peace. But what in the United States we're taught is that everyone should be like us, right? And so then solidarity becomes kind of like a charity a lot of the time when it comes to movements like the Zapatistas or like Palestinians, or and this is coming from someone just from personal experience. I studied international studies that became global studies in the mid 2000s, and the whole training was that we need to go out there and give people what we have here, which is capitalism, right? And so then what that does is it makes it so that we don't realize that we're also in struggle here. So solidarity isn't like a charity, it's struggling actually side by side. Where none of us is free, and especially those of us living in cities so dependent on capital are even less free, right, than those who know how to live without it, like native land-based peoples, like the Zapatistas, right? And so how can we do a solidarity that's genuinely solidarity, where we're struggling together so that we can all be free, including ourselves? We have an above below circulation of power that's so heavy where we live, that to think that other movements, they just need our money, right? Like they tell us all the time, you need to struggle where you're from because you're not free, right? And so I think that having that a frame where we are struggling side by side, rather than just providing a solidarity through words or through money or through those kinds of things, like what is it that we're doing? And I also do think though that like pulling resources, as like with everything, right? Like if we have a lot of resources in this geography, maybe it's easier for us to pull them for other geographies, right? But being in right relation with them, we're never going to be able obviously to like meet every other movement and have like some kind of relationship with them. But I think that if we follow a principle of how can we share the world with all our difference, then geopolitically we're going to have to ask new questions rather than pray that China's going to save us or Russia's going to save, that sort of thing, which is kind of like very common on the left right now, that the BRICS is going to save us, Iran is going to save us, that sort of thing. And realizing we're actually on our own. They have depopulation plans for us they don't want us to know about, right? We need to figure out how we're going to build shelter and connect with each other. And I do think that that's like a geography for resistance in our time is a webbed geography with different land bases, as big or as small as they may be, that are in relation, so that when something happens in one, and especially like with climate collapse, nobody knows what the weather's going to be like anywhere anymore, right? We might have to become seasonal migrants. We will have to become, it sounds like, seasonal migrants, right? So getting to know each other in different geographies is going to be our power, so that we can have trust in that and that sort of mobility and shelter. So I think that, yeah, recognizing that we all need to be in struggle right now. I'll just share something that may be hopeful. I think it's exciting. A friend of mine, she's a healer. She's Sami. She's in Mexico right now training with abuelas. And she kept getting this dream from her ancestors that she needed to build a video game, and she kept ignoring it. And she finally decided not to ignore it. And so she's recruited several of us, including the one of the makers of Pokemon Go and World of Warcraft, who like hate the gaming industry and want to create something really beautiful. She's recruited us to build a game where you're incentivized to go outside and talk to an elder and plant a tree and share some seeds, you know, and find your gift within the game and leave the game. You can add to the game and become an elder for future players. But the idea is to eventually leave the game so that you're not just contributing to your community, you're also building your shelter with your community and getting to know other communities where difference can be our power, because we need to shelter from this storm. And I think that recognizing that the above below situation is not just between individuals, it's between an entire elite class that wants the world, the earth, just for themselves and doesn't want us here anymore. Now that we're no longer helpful as waged workers because now they have their robots and their AI, right? So now we're an obstacle, we're a nuisance. So we only have each other. So solidarity is going to need to look like, how do we have each other's backs, right? Rather than here's something that you don't have and you have nothing to contribute to me. You know, like it needs to be, what is it that we have for each other in that way? Thank you for
That's so
that.
cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Quiquivix, for joining us, for sharing your wisdom and your research and being in conversation with us. You're so deeply appreciated. I'm so honored that you are here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And may everybody have a beautiful day. Thank you all for attending, for being part of this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's been such an honor and a pleasure. Take care.